This was the life of a high-voltage lineman in the USA, 1966. 42 out of every 100,000 linemen died on the job every year. That was the fatality rate for electrical power line workers in the United States, a number that made the profession one of the most dangerous in the American economy by any measure applied. Electrocution was the leading cause of death. Current passing through the body and triggering ventricular fibrillation in the heart, a condition in which the heart muscle quivers instead of contracting, cutting off blood flow to the brain within seconds. Nearly all of those deaths, more than 99%, were due to electrocution rather than falls or other trauma, though falls claimed roughly 21% of all lineman fatalities, and were themselves often caused by electrocution. A man who contacted a live line lost muscle control in the instant of the shock and fell from whatever height he was working at. An additional 2,400 out of every 100,000 linemen suffered serious non-fatal injuries each year: electrical burns, broken bones, amputations from mechanical trauma, injuries that ended or permanently altered careers and that left marks on the body that remained visible for the rest of a man's life. In 1966, these numbers existed, but the regulatory framework designed to reduce them was still years from its full development. The Occupational Safety and Health Act was still 4 years away. The specific standards for electrical utility work that would eventually govern how close a lineman could work to an energized conductor of a given voltage, what protective equipment was required, and how operations had to be planned and supervised were being developed incrementally, informed in no small part by the deaths that kept happening in the absence of comprehensive federal standards. The lineman of 1966 was the most essential, invisible worker in the American electrical system, the man who kept the power on, and he did his work at heights and voltages that the people switching on their lights never thought about. The American electrical grid in 1966 was in the middle of one of the most rapid expansions in its history. The post-war building boom had created millions of new homes, new subdivisions, new commercial developments, and new industrial facilities, all of which needed to be connected to the electrical system. The rural electrification programs that had been extending power to farm communities since the 1930s were still adding connections in areas that had not yet been reached. Industrial demand was growing as the American economy expanded. The grid that served all of this demand was a network of transmission lines, distribution lines, substations, and transformers that had to be built, maintained, repaired, and extended continuously to stay ahead of the load it carried. The men who did that work, who climbed the poles, strung the wire, installed the transformers, spliced the cables, and kept the system operational in all conditions of weather and emergency, were the linemen. And in 1966, there were more of them working more hours on more miles of line than at almost any previous point in the industry's history. The expansion of the grid was the defining context of their working lives, shaping both the volume of work available and the specific conditions under which it was performed. New construction running through terrain that had not been traversed before, new connections being made to a system that was already energized and carrying load, new equipment being integrated into infrastructure that had been built to different standards in previous decades. Before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. The pole was the fundamental unit of the lineman's working environment in 1966, the vertical element around which all distribution line work organized itself. Wooden utility poles in the mid-1960s were typically 35 to 45 feet tall for distribution work, taller for transmission work, made of treated wood usually Douglas fir or southern yellow pine, that had been pressure-treated with preservatives to resist the decay that would otherwise make a wooden pole unusable within a few years of installation. The lineman climbed the pole using a pair of climbing spikes, steel gaff points mounted on steel shanks that strapped to the inside of his legs, that he drove into the wood with each step, ascending hand over hand while his body belt, a heavy leather strap that encircled the pole, kept him from falling backward as he transferred weight from one gaff to the next. At the top, he positioned himself with the body belt, adjusted to the right length to hold him against the pole, with both hands free to works. The view from the top of a 40-foot distribution pole was a clear line of sight to everything in the surrounding landscape, the neighborhood below, the other poles running the line, the wires themselves, and the particular hazard that experienced linemen called the most dangerous moment of every job. The instant when a hand or a tool or an inadvertently positioned elbow came within the minimum safe approach distance of an energized conductor carrying thousands of volts of alternating current. The specific physics of high-voltage electrocution were, in 1966, understood well enough that the industry had developed a set of protective practices and equipment designed to keep the lineman's body from completing a circuit between an energized conductor and a ground. The rubber gloves, thick, heavy insulating gloves, rated for the specific voltage level at which the lineman was working, were the primary personal protective barrier between the lineman's hands and a live conductor. They were worn over cotton inner gloves to absorb perspiration, inspected before every use for pinholes or tears that would compromise their insulating value, and tested regularly at utility company facilities to verify that their insulating properties had not degraded. Rubber sleeves covered the arms above the gloves. Cover-up equipment, rubber blankets, line hoses, and insulating covers in various shapes was applied to energized conductors and equipment near the work area to prevent accidental contact. Hot sticks, insulated fiberglass poles in various configurations, allowed the lineman to manipulate energized equipment from a safe distance without direct hand contact. The discipline of using these tools correctly, in the right sequence, verifying at every step that the protection was in place before moving to the next operation, was what separated a competent lineman from one who was going to be the subject of an accident investigation. The tools worked when they were used correctly. When they were not used correctly, when a cover-up slipped, when a rubber glove had an undetected pinhole, when a hot stick was used at an angle that brought the lineman's hand inside the minimum safe approach distance, the consequences arrived without warning and without appeal. The distinction between distribution line work and transmission line work defined two distinct professional worlds within the lineman trade. Distribution linemen worked on the lower voltage lines, typically ranging from 4,000 to 35,000 volts, that carried power from substations to homes and businesses along the poles that lined residential streets and rural roads. Transmission linemen worked on the high-voltage lines, often ranging from 115,000 to 765,000 volts or higher, that carried bulk power across long distances between generating stations and substations on towers that could stand over 100 feet tall. The physics of transmission line work at those voltages created additional hazards that had no equivalent on distribution work. At extremely high voltages, a conductor does not need to be physically contacted for current to arc across a gap of air to a grounded object. The electric field surrounding a very high voltage conductor could energize nearby metal objects through induction, and the safe approach distances for transmission line work were measured in feet rather than inches. A small number of specially trained linemen in 1966 performed what was called bare hand work, working directly on energized transmission lines from helicopters or insulated platforms. Their bodies electrically bonded to the line so that they and the conductor were at the same potential and no current flowed through them. This required specific training, specific equipment, and a level of technical understanding of electrical principles that went well beyond what most lineman training programs provided. The apprenticeship that a new lineman entered in 1966 was a 4-year program that combined classroom instruction in electrical theory, safety procedures, and the specific technical knowledge of the trade with progressive on-the-job experience on actual line crews. In the first year, an apprentice did primarily groundwork, handling materials, setting up the work zone, learning to operate the equipment and tools of the trade from the bottom up. The climb came after the apprentice had demonstrated the basic knowledge and physical readiness that the journeyman lineman on the crew judged adequate, learning to climb a pole correctly, to set the gaff at the right angle, to bite the wood without slipping, to transfer weight smoothly from one gaff to the next without losing contact, to position the body belt and adjust the working position at the top. It took time and repetition to become automatic. The physical demands of climbing, combined with the weight of the tool belt that a working lineman carried, required a level of upper body and leg strength and endurance that had to be developed through the work itself. The culture of the trade emphasized learning by doing under the direct supervision of experienced journeymen, and the knowledge that was transferred in that process included not just the technical procedures, but the specific situational awareness that told an experienced lineman when something about a job felt wrong, when the conditions were different from what the plan assumed, when the equipment was not behaving as expected, when the decision to stop and reassess was the right call. Storm work was the defining emergency condition of the lineman's profession in 1966, the circumstance that compressed all the ordinary hazards of the trade into their most concentrated form and added the specific additional hazards of working in conditions that the ordinary work week did not present. When a major storm, a winter ice storm, a hurricane making landfall along the Gulf or Atlantic coast, a series of severe thunderstorms tracking through the Midwest, took down power lines across a service territory, the utility sent its linemen out to restore service. And those men worked until the service was restored, regardless of how many hours that took. Storm restoration in 1966 was done largely without the electronic outage management systems and GPS-based crew tracking that modern utilities use. Linemen patrolled their circuits by truck, looking for damage, and reported what they found by radio to dispatch centers that were managing restoration across the entire affected territory with limited information about what was happening on the ground. The work happened in whatever weather the storm had left behind: rain, ice, cold, wind, darkness, and it happened at speed, because the pressure to restore service quickly was enormous, and because the overtime pay that storm work generated was part of the economic arithmetic that brought linemen to the work from outside their normal service territories when the local crew could not restore service fast enough. 2 linemen working in storm conditions in Alabama died restoring power after Hurricane Ida in September of 2021. The specific hazards that killed them, downed lines, unstable poles, energized conductors in contact with water or other grounded objects, were the same hazards that had been killing linemen in storm conditions since the first poles went up. The physical toll of a career as a high-voltage lineman accumulated in ways that were visible and invisible in roughly equal measure. The visible toll was in the hands. The calluses, the specific pattern of small burns, and scars from near contacts and tool slips, The fingers that had been pinched in clamps or scraped against conductor strands across years of work, the occasional more significant injury from a gaff slipping on a wet pole, or a tool falling from height and striking the man below. The invisible toll was in the back and the knees, the decades of climbing, of working in awkward positions at height with a tool belt that weighed 20 to 30 pounds, of the specific physical demands of pole work on terrain that was never flat, and in weather that ranged from high summer heat to winter ice. By the time a journeyman lineman in 1966 reached his late 40s or early 50s, the cumulative physical effect of the work was typically evident in the specific ways his body had adapted and been worn by what it had been asked to do. The men who stayed in the trade for 30 years and retired as journeymen or crew foremen carried that accumulated history in their bodies, alongside the specific technical knowledge that no training program fully replicated and no book fully contained. The knowledge of how electricity actually behaved in the specific situations that the job presented, learned through years of handling it directly, in real conditions, with real consequences for errors. The lineman's work was invisible to the people it served in the most complete sense possible. The only time most Americans thought about the power lines that ran overhead was when the power went out. The electricity that ran the refrigerator and the television and the lights and the furnace arrived through a system whose maintenance and operation were performed entirely out of sight by men whose working conditions, whose training, whose risks, and whose injuries were unknown to the households that depended on their work. The linemen of 1966 shared this condition with most of the workers who maintained the physical infrastructure of American life, the men who kept the pipes flowing and the roads passable and the bridges standing and the rails clear, whose essential contribution to daily life was exactly as invisible as it was total. He went up the pole in the dark or in the rain or in the ice or in the heat of a Texas August, and he kept the lights on. That was the job. That was what it cost. The regulatory improvements that came after 1966, the OSHA standards for electrical utilities work, the minimum approach distance tables for different voltage levels, the mandatory rubber insulating equipment inspection programs, the fall protection requirements, reduced the lineman death toll significantly over the following decades. The fatality rate that stood at 42 per 100,000 in the 1960s fell as the specific hazards were identified, measured, and addressed through engineering controls and protective equipment requirements. That decline represents thousands of men who went home from a shift that, in the regulatory environment of 1966, might not have ended safely. The linemen, who died before those improvements arrived, paid the price that made the case for them. Their deaths documented in accident reports that accumulated into the evidentiary foundation on which the OSHA electrical standards were built. The utility poles they climbed are still standing across the American landscape. Their names are not on them. The bucket truck, the aerial work platform mounted on a utility vehicle that could raise a lineman in a fiberglass insulated bucket to working height without requiring pole climbing, was becoming more common in distribution line work by 1966, and it changed the physical experience of the work in significant ways. A lineman in a bucket did not need to maintain his position through the strength and balance of his legs and his body belt. The bucket held him. He could carry more tools and more materials to the work position because he was not limited by what he could carry while climbing. He could work longer at height without the physical fatigue that pole climbing imposed. But the bucket truck also introduced new hazards and did not eliminate the old ones. The bucket's insulating properties depended on the cleanliness and integrity of the fiberglass, contaminated with grime, moisture, or conductive materials, It could fail to provide the isolation it was supposed to offer. The stability of the bucket at height depended on the outriggers being properly deployed on ground that was level and solid, conditions that were not always present on the varied terrain where distribution line work happened. And pole climbing remained the only option, in many situations where a bucket truck could not reach or maneuver, on steep terrain in areas with overhead obstructions, on poles that were accessible only on foot. The journeyman lineman of 1966 needed both skills, and the transition between them required its own discipline, the specific awareness of which hazards applied to which work method, and the particular vigilance required in the specific moments when the transition between one method and another created conditions that neither training module had fully anticipated. The culture of the lineman trade in 1966 carried a specific attitude toward risk that was not unique to this profession, but was particularly pronounced in it. A culture that valued toughness, competence, and the ability to work in conditions that most people would find frightening, and that expressed those values in a way that sometimes worked against the systematic caution that the work actually required. The phrase that would later be identified as a safety problem in lineman culture. That might be what you learned in training, but this is how we do it in the field. It represented a real tension between the formal safety procedures that training programs taught and the informal practices that developed on actual crews working under actual time pressure in actual field conditions. Experienced linemen, who had been doing the work for 20 years without a serious incident, sometimes developed a confidence in their own judgment that led them to skip steps in the protective procedure, to rely on experience rather than on the systematic application of every required safeguard. That confidence was not unfounded. Experience genuinely mattered in this work, and the judgment developed through years of handling energized equipment was real and valuable. It was also, in specific circumstances, exactly what got men killed, because the energy involved in high-voltage line work did not accommodate the kind of near miss that taught a lesson without killing the student. The mistake that mattered in this occupation was not correctable after the fact.